Welcome to the fourth branch program. Glad you can make it. I am MD. This program is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Stay tuned as we begin the discussion of a very important, interesting, and enlightening topic. Hope to hear from you soon. Happy listening.
Ignorance is the biggest threat to any democracy. It is, however, the ignorance of the ignorance which represents the greatest danger to society. It is what turns an ignorant man into a lunatic. Thus lies the danger, the peril even of a man, a community, a state, a country, yes, even a society. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, said that the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all. Indeed, it does. We've seen it, have we not? We've witnessed it. We are all living it, are we not? All men are born ignorant. Many have chosen to stay and live in ignorance. Only a few recognize ignorance is indeed the root and stem of all evil and choose to be ignorant no more. Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the fourth branch program. First, a warning. This program is not suitable for all audiences. I repeat, the content of this program is not for everyone. To find out if it's suitable to you, answer the following two questions. Question 1. Would you entrust your teenage daughter to a non-rapist? Question 2. Would you have a non-pedophile cared for your toddler? Once again, question 1. Would you entrust your teenage daughter to a non-rapist? Question 2. Would you have a non-pedophile cared for your toddler? Your time is up, obviously. If you had difficulty answering either question, this program is not for you. If you answer yes to either or to both questions, this program is definitely not for you. But if both of your answers are absolutely not, this program is catered exclusively to you. You should stick around. It is enlightening, educational, and informative. Join me here on the 4th branch at 10:30 a.m. every Saturday. And every weekday at 2 p.m. This is the 4th branch.
Common sense in a world of chaos.
This program will resume in just a moment.
Hello everyone, I am MD and you are on the 4th branch program. We continue the discussion today about jeopardy that our democracy is facing, and also we will debate war on blacks. At this point, we're talking about slave trades, and we will touch today on the beginning of the rebellion. First, why is our democracy is in serious jeopardy? Now, conversation with a number of people, depending on which political affiliation those individuals belong to, they have a very different definition of why our democracy is in jeopardy. Yesterday, I related to you that a number of Republicans, individuals who support Donald Trump at all costs, they believe that our democracy is indeed in jeopardy, but the blame falls squarely on the Democrats, the libtards, and of course, on anyone who is not a Trumpublican. Now, let's look at the predicament that we're in. First, it is without precedence, the current situation we have here today. A president of the United States who is accused of so many scandals, one of which is the one that is the most important to us. that a president sits in the Oval Office, and it seems, by all accounts, with the help of a foreign entity. Now, most of the debate, the discussion here in the United States of America always end up not having any solution or any path forward, because each party decide to debate the topic, to approach the problem based on political views. Gone are the days when people used to be patriot, where the priority was the country comes first and everything else can take a back seat. For the past, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, we can say without any hesitation that Republican Party as a whole has shifted from those claims of being the party that defends the republic, the party that has a high level of morality, the party that stands for something great, to a party that only deceives in order to advance their own agenda. And we have many, many examples. We can go as far back as Ronald Reagan, who is, and I use that particular period because a lot of Republicans use Ronald Reagan as the saint, the person that they consider as being the model that every leader in the Republican Party ought to use, ought to follow. In fact, Ronald Reagan becomes almost a saint in the Republican Party. Now, I strongly suggest that you read my article, Ronald Reagan, a Hero Which Never Was. And you will find it pretty enlightening. It's not opinion, it's based on facts of his presidency. Now, having said that, the current predicament we have, and like most people, I could have just shrugged it off and move along. But we have millions of individuals here in the United States who are those people were, whether some I would say were voluntarily put in that predicament, and others, because it benefit them, put those individuals in that predicament. It is almost impossible to have a logical discussion with a Republican and now with Trumpublican. And the reason for that is because whatever that they consider as their argument for a particular situation, nobody can move them from that position that they take, even when they recognize that the position is actually bad for them, bad for their party, and bad for the country, but they stand in the decision with the position that they take. They're not going to budge. Now, people who play politics, of course, each party try to advance their own position, and because of that, in fact, in Washington, we call those type of predicament, those type of situation, gridlock, because politicians of one party would not budge, would not compromise, and as such, if they take the position, for instance, Democrats would tell you that the face of this phone is black, right? But Republican would argue that's not the case. And it doesn't matter what logic you bring to the table, they will not move from their position. Now, for legislators, we know it's because it benefits them to stand in the position that they take, even when they recognize it's wrong. Case in point, during the Obama tenure, Republican Party as a whole was against Obamacare. Well, the Healthcare Act, aka Obamacare. And for 8 years, they voted again and again and again to repeal Obamacare. Now, there was no argument whatsoever that anybody could bring forth to the table for Republican legislators to change their mind. Now, they knew they were wrong. And I know that, and I'm going to prove it to you. They knew that they were wrong, but because it served their purpose, and the purpose that it served is to keep their constituent in ignorance, and that guaranteed them to be reelected. And on top of that, they have a mouthpiece, a propaganda machine, Fox, which people in the Republican Party would, whether it's legislators or governors and so on, that's the network that they go to in order to continue to peddle a message, however wrong they know it is, however bad, however false they know it is, but it serves their agenda, which is to guarantee their political career. Now, those people are not patriots. They will tell you differently because, well, it's a word, it's an expression, so anybody can use it. But as the Bible says, it's by their actions, by the fruits that they bear, you will recognize them. So someone tell you that they're patriot, anybody can tell you that. The devil would tell you there is a saint, but that doesn't make the devil a saint. It's by the fruits that they bear, by their action, that you recognize that Republicans for the last quarter of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, they have legislators, elected officials, they have dealt almost exclusively in deception. Now, I know the example that I just gave you earlier, I know that they knew that opposing the Healthcare Act was wrong because they know what it would do for people, the kind of benefit the people who take advantage of it would have, and yet they oppose it because it benefits them. Keeping their constituent in ignorance is a gold mine for Republican legislators, for Republican elected officials. Now, how do I know they know it was wrong? It's because, if you recall, during the 2018 midterm election, those same Republicans, all of them, remember during the Obama tenure, there was not a single Republican who would see it right for them to stand and say, you know what? It may not be a perfect healthcare act, but let's work on ironing out the part that we think needs to be changed, but let's give the people, the constituent in the country, a healthcare act that they can use. No, they oppose it completely. They voted during the Obama term 62 times to repeal it. And yet, they knew what they were doing was wrong. How do I know that? During the midterm election, all of those Republicans who were drumming the beat that Obamacare is bad for you, during the midterm election, when it became clear that the people who actually have enrolled in Obamacare and the people who have heard of the advantage of being an enrollee of Obamacare, now all of a sudden they changed their tune. Now, if it were to be bad, then it's bad. You cannot all of a sudden change your tune and say, oh, well, if you elect me, if you send me back to Washington, I'll make sure that you do not lose that. So we know Republican legislators, elected officials, they trade in deception. They rely exclusively on the ignorance of the constituent to advance their agenda. And we know that ignorance is the biggest threat to our democracy. How do we know that? It's because when people stay in ignorance, which is currently the predicament that 40% of the population, the Trumpublican, this is where they are today. They are in complete ignorance of what their position does to our democracy. But one of the problems that the country faces when we have a serious problem like this is the fact that people in the media, whether it's pundit, journalists, opinion writer, and politician, they are dancing around the issue and pointing the fingers, calling the devil by its name. And the problem that we have today is the deep ignorance within the Trumpublican Party, which continue to support an individual who has not hidden his agenda. It is to destroy our way of life, to destroy the apparatus of our democracy, to destroy the institution which have guaranteed our democracy, the institution that makes our democracy the envy of the world. Donald Trump has not been hiding his hands. He has put it right in front of us as to what he has in mind. It's the ignorance of the individuals who have supported Donald Trump, who had voted for him, and who continue to support him, despite the fact that all those elements are in full display. Now, the conversation I had with a few Trumpublicans sometimes get me to, if I had hair, to just pull my hair. Thank God I don't have much, because it's impossible to understand, and sometimes conversing with a Trumpublican has to get you to ask the question, is there a brain in that individual? And I don't say that as a matter of insult, although I understand that it comes out as an insult. Because logic is logic. There is no if and but about it. 2 plus 2 are 4, regardless of which political party you belong to. Now, someone said 2 plus 2 are 5. You can understand there is no way around that. That means the person who said 2 plus 2 are 5 actually is wrong. There is no if and but about it. There is no dancing around it. It's that. Now, we know from the 2016 presidential election that most Trumpublicans would claim that they're patriot, but their actions clearly say they are not. Because they were presented with facts of a candidate, Donald Trump at that time, who not only publicly inviting a foreign entity to meddle in our internal affairs, but when it became very clear that was the case, those people, those individuals, those Trump supporters, you know what they were chanting? They love WikiLeaks. Even not too long ago, I had a conversation with one of those Trumpublicans, and they felt that, well, that was good that WikiLeaks released those information. And Donald Trump was at the forefront encouraging WikiLeaks to do so. At that time, we did not know that WikiLeaks was a front for Russia. Irrelevant, because WikiLeaks is a foreign entity and should not be meddling in our election, in our internal affair. And yet, the individual, the candidate who vied for the highest office in the land, calling on foreign entity to come and meddle in our internal affair. At that time, we had no idea that Donald Trump was so deep in bed with foreign government. And it still did not matter. I remember how much I was screaming at the top of my lung to shut out WikiLeaks. Again, we did not know that WikiLeaks was a front for Russia, but from a patriot perspective, if you are a patriot, not when you put your hand on your chest during national anthem and that's what makes you a patriot. This is not patriotism. But if you are a patriot, and the very definition of a patriot is someone who would defend the country, his or her country, at all costs, even his or her life. That's not what we saw with the Donald Trump supporters. What we saw is a bunch of individuals who would rather destroy our system of democracy in order to elect an individual. You cannot claim patriotism. Now, a lot of pundit, journalists, opinion writers, even politicians suggested that, well, when Donald Trump become president, he's going to be a different individual. He's going to be a different man. Maybe that will make up for his outrageousness. 2 years, we know that's not the case. In fact, it has gotten worse. Since the day that he took an oath of office, he has been attacking our democracy. Now, the framers of the Constitution anticipated something like that we would have an individual who is either incompetent or who is a rogue agent. Donald Trump happened to be both. But what the framers of the Constitution did not anticipate is a legislative body owned by a political party that's also part of the problem. Because Republicans can scream all they want that they are patriot, but for the past 2 years, they prove beyond reasonable doubt that they do not have any care for the United States of America. Because everything that they did was to help Donald Trump advance his agenda of undermining our democracy. And that's what makes the problem a serious problem. Our democracy has been under attack since January 20th, 2017, not only by Donald Trump, but by the whole legislative body fully controlled by the Republican. Now, the framers of the Constitution, maybe, and I'm assuming they never anticipated that problem. Now, let's assume for sake of conversation that they did. Well, they probably did not anticipate that we will have a political party constituent who would be so ignorant that they too would go along with that. That they could not possibly anticipate. Executive branch goes rogue, incompetent. Legislative body in collusion with the executive branch, and you have the constituent completely ignorant going along with everything. I guarantee you there is no way in the world that the framers of the Constitution could have anticipated that everybody involved in the process was not patriot. There is no way that could have been are anticipated. And there is no argument for the Republican Party at this point to say, oh, of course we are patriot. No, you're not. Patriotism is not a word to toss around. Your patriotism has to be manifested in your action. And in fact, forget about patriotism, especially for the legislators, because the Constitution provided the legislative branch the tools necessary to stop, to rein in, to put a guardrail against a rogue executive branch. So let alone, you don't even have to be patriots. So yes, our democracy has been in constant attack by the executive branch, in serious jeopardy by the legislative body, and in grave danger by the constituent. And I said, you cannot be dancing around the fact that the whole constituency in the Republican Party is completely living in ignorance. It helps the legislators because it serves them well. Those constituents go to the poll and send them back to Washington. Why would they not continue to peddle falsehoods in order to keep that constituency? And that tells you also they are not patriot either. Because a patriot, you see, leadership, real leadership is not about the next election. That's not leadership. In fact, calling Republican leaders is an assault to leaders, an affront to leaders, because leadership is not about the next election. Leadership is about the next generation. Because you get elected as member of Congress or the Senate, not for you to stay there and continue to be there just for the sake of being there. The very point is to advance the affairs of the country, not your personal affairs, the affairs of the country. Now, if the constituent were also patriot, they too would have found it necessary to get rid of those individuals who are not doing the job for which they were elected. But unfortunately, much unfortunately, there is no guardrail for that kind of problem. The executive branch is incompetent, rogue agent, in bed with a foreign government. The legislative body, fully controlled by one single party, the Republican Party, completely in sync with the executive branch, doing everything possible to help the executive branch destroy the institutions that have made America the envy of the world. And we have the constituent completely waiting in ignorance. As far as they're concerned, everything is great. As it stands today, there are 17 investigations against the sitting president. That doesn't count even the Robert Mueller investigation. Yes, a sitting president is so corrupt, and yet you're hearing people who support Trump. Well, I haven't heard anything wrong. I haven't seen anything yet. Seriously? Can someone be that ignorant? That's the kind of conversation that I have to be subjected to talking to Trumpublicans. I haven't seen anything wrong. Everybody's been accusing Trump. Have you seen anybody accusing any president that much of so many crimes, so many scandals. Now, a better question, would you have been okay with any other president being in that predicament? Now, here's a much better question. You think Donald Trump is innocent of all those crimes he's being accused of?
I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then.
War on blacks. It's a topic we use to talk about race relation in the United States of America. We are not talking about slave trades. The rebellion begins. For those who have not watched this program before, we encourage you to visit the People Branch YouTube channel, where we have all videos of previous presentation, in which we also provided a lengthy introduction, 5 or 6 videos of which provided you kind of a basis, a background for this program. One aspect of which I repeat every time that we have the program. War on blacks is a topic to discuss race relation, but it also suggests there are casualties. And for blacks, there have been casualties, plenty. Physical, psychological, emotional, financial. And the reason we call it war is because those casualties have been inflicted on blacks, not by themselves, by the other side, the white society. Now for you, those of you who have not seen this program before, let me put it right back in the mix so that we have a great understanding. We have to discuss the problem in the country, racism and discrimination. Prejudice as well. Now we know there are 2 major groups. We will discuss the subgroup within those 2 major groups, but in the white camp, there are 2 major groups, and each group has millions of individuals. There is a group of racists, bigots, those who discriminate. There are millions of those whites living right here in the United States. And there is another group, also millions of whites, who are not racist, who do not discriminate. That's the big problem talking about race relation. In fact, that problem is the reason that race relation in America is a topic that's been avoided at all costs. Blacks avoid it, whites avoid it, It's not talked about on network because they fear that, you know, the audience will simply walk away because they don't want to hear about that. And yet, and that is the big issue, and yet every time something happens to blacks, there are an army of experts who come on TV, and what do they suggest? We have to have more conversation about race relation. Well, this is what War on Blacks is. A conversation about race relation in America. Now, we do not mince words. We tell you the story the way it is, the way it happened, the way that blacks live in the United States of America. And we also tell the story the way that it is in the country. Now, people who are afraid of talking about race relation in America, they try to really go around the issue, the topic, to talk about it. And that's a reason there cannot be any cure, because unless you understand the disease, you cannot propose a solution. So the problem is simply that there are two major groups of whites in the country. A group, millions of them, who discriminate, who are racist. There is no if and but about that. And we're not talking about the white nationalists. We're not talking about the KKK. This is a very small group. If that were the only whites who discriminate in the country, we would not have had that problem in the country. But we know that's not the case. We have millions of such people, white, who are racist, who are bigots, and who discriminate. And we have millions of others who are not racist, who do not discriminate. Now, when we talk about the topic, much unfortunately, I always refer to as white. But keep that in mind. This is the premise of this conversation. And we use the example of the Civil War to really make a striking difference between those two groups. During the Civil War, there were two very distinct groups. There was a group comprised exclusively of whites who fought tooth and nail with their lives to keep slavery around. Those are the racists, the bigots, those who did not care that blacks are a human being as well, but as far as they are concerned, they're supposed to stay in slavery and continue to help them getting richer and richer. It didn't matter. And there were the group of whites who fought side by side with blacks to end slavery. They died with blacks to end slavery. So we know the situation remains exactly the same, that we still have the whites who fought to keep slavery, their lineage, their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids, which unfortunately you may be part of that lineage. So this is the premise of this conversation. Now, as we continue the conversation, we will expose the subgroup within those two groups, because it's not really black and white. Now, the reason it's that important is because if it were to be just the KKK, the white nationalists, it would be really a moot issue, because the casualties that blacks have been subjected to would have been minimal or non-existent. But we know that's not the case, because the casualties are everywhere. It started a long time ago, 1492. Christopher Columbus discovered America. And that was the worst thing that happened to blacks. And there has been slave trades ever since. 1619, That's the first time a shipment of black, 20 of them, dropped here in America, Jamestown, Virginia. And that has not abated until 1865, during which Abraham Lincoln signed the executive order for the emancipation of blacks. Now, in between, you can imagine, and that's the part we want to bring forth so that you understand that war on blacks started a very long time ago. Blacks lived in Africa. They did not go and bother anybody. They were living their life just like anybody else. And a group of whites declared war on them, chased them down, captured them, chained them, and put them down on the lower level of a boat for a journey that will last weeks at a time. Some did not make it to America because they died during the journey. And those who made it came sick. And on top of that, they were tortured. Like things that would make you cry just hearing the kind of torture that they were put through. And whites called blacks criminal. Every chance they have. In fact, the label that have been put on blacks, that's still going on today, that bad image, those labels, they violent, they criminal, they thieves, didn't start yesterday. It started all the way back during slavery. And there is plenty of reason for that. Now, if someone were to come to your house and you become a hostage, they take your wife and put in one room, they put you in another room, and the kids, no matter how old they are, baby and so on, and separate them, and the next thing you know, you don't know where your wife goes, you don't know where those children goes, because each one of them goes in a different way. That was what blacks were being put through. That's torture number one. And blacks, well, as far as we know, that white society, the whites have, especially those who promote slavery, those who wanted to keep things the way they were, they came up with tools that would make it impossible for blacks to move forward. And that's the reason today, this image you hear of blacks, they thieves, they violent, they this and that, were tools that were used by those same individuals, slave owners, when they were in a position to lose, they began to lose grips on slavery. It started that way for blacks. Whites declared war on blacks. So when you hear slave trade, it sounds like a nice term. Slave trade, it shouldn't have happened, human trafficking. But the expression itself does not explain the horror that whites inflicted on blacks. But they call black criminal. They went to Africa, chased them down with rifle, shoot them down, and for those they managed to capture, they chain them separate, divide the families, get them on a boat on a journey that lasted weeks to come to America to become slave. But oh, blacks are the criminals. You know, it's the blacks that are criminal, that are violent. They chase blacks from their country, rifle in hand, shoot them down. Not because black did anything to white. But guess what? Blacks are the ones that are called criminal. And this is the stigma that still stays on blacks, despite the fact that whites were the ones that were chasing them and torturing them and killing them without any accountability. But whites were never called criminal because, you know, oh, it was just slave trade, you know. And that's what makes this divide, this war on blacks, such an important topic that needs to be told and understood, because whites of this generation, or probably 2 generations before, still live with the information passed down to them about blacks being violent, being criminal, being thieves, and they keep passing it down. That's why today we live in a society where blacks have all the negative connotation attached to them. But, you know, whites are, you know, those religious people that go to church. They well fed, they well dressed, while the blacks were in the field working 18 hours after being tortured. But they are the criminal, they are the thieves. Do you know why whites call blacks thieves? It's because the slave owners did not feed them, actually used starvation as a form of punishment. The same slave who had to work 18 hours in the field, the slave owners were starving those slaves in order to teach them a lesson. And guess how, you know, living organism, we have to eat. So what do you think those slaves had to do in order to survive? They had to steal in order to get food to eat. But the white slave owners never passed down the story to the next generation that the reason that the black slave had to steal is to survive, because he, the slave owner, was starving the slave to death. But that story did not get passed down to the next generation. So blacks are thieves. Oh, whites, you know, churchgoers, put food on the table. They have the black women that serve as maid in the house that prepare the food, and they sit and they eat, they drink, they laugh, they smile, while the blacks in the field working 18 hours, being beaten to the point that they bled, and they had to steal food in order to survive. As such, they are thieves. Now, that story is being told to you to understand where all these things come from, so that you also begin to understand why the rebellions, because it is a prelude to explaining to you the rebellion, because there is no human being on the face of this planet who would like to be oppressed. No one. Blacks were, of course, at a disadvantage. Not only they were oppressed because they didn't have the means to fight, but they were chained, especially the men. They were chained even working in the field. Not only they were chained, but they had guard with rifle watching them. So you are told a story that your ancestor, you know, the great, 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 great grandpa, nice man. He provided for his family. He was a loving father, a loving husband. I'm sure he was. But the story they never passed down to you, the kind of torture that your ancestor, that nice ancestor, the loving husband, the great father, the story they never passed down to you, to the next generation, and all the way to you, is how much of a monster that loving father was towards the slave. Never passed down that story to you. You didn't need to hear about it. You know why? Because, well, your ancestors went to church, they had good housing, they had good food on the table, they had good life, their children went to school. In fact, one of the things that they made sure that blacks did not have the opportunity to learn to read and to write. Oh, they probably didn't tell you that when you finding out that blacks, mostly in the South, they do not know how to read and write. But that story is not passed to you, to the next generation, so it is lost. Because the only story that's passed to you, to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, is that your ancestor was great father, great husband, great man. But he was a monster of a slave owner. A story that you never heard or never know. Yes, that great, 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 great grandpa, while he was doing all that for his family, he was torturing the black slaves, the people that and that's the part that had to boggle the mind, because you have slaves working for you 18 hours a day, and yet you put that same individual through some horrific torture that sometimes they die. A story untold to the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that, to the point now today you're looking at the blacks that live either across the street or 2 blocks down from you, and you're looking at those blacks in this den because they live in poverty. Some of them may not even know how to read and write. But it so happened, ironically, coincidentally, that your ancestor is responsible for that black problem, because that black that you're looking at 2 streets down, 2 blocks down, or across the street from you, his ancestor was a slave and suffered the consequences of the torture by your ancestor. Story that is not told to you because, you know, it's not your problem. And today, you probably live a life and think, that's not your problem. You weren't a slave owner. You weren't around during slavery. So how could you possibly be responsible for that? Well, you know, the property that you own, the land that you own, the wealth that's left behind for you, on the back of the slaves. Yes, you are part of the problem indirectly. So yes, you may want to disavow the fact that you have nothing to do with slavery. You have nothing to do with those blacks living in poverty a few blocks down. Because neither you nor those blacks were born during slavery time. But one thing stays constant. During slavery, your ancestor used blacks to further his financial goal. He became richer and richer. He grabbed more land, get more wealth, and pass it down to the next generation and the next generation. In the meantime, your lineage goes to school, get a college degree. Guess what happening to the blacks in the meantime? They slave, and the next generation was slave, and the generation after that was slave. Never get the opportunity that you got. They didn't have land. They didn't know how to read and write. And it continued that way and that way and that way. While you going up the social status ladder, the financial ladder, the wealth ladder, they stay stagnant and going further down. So yes, you have everything to do with blacks' predicament today. To disavow it doesn't make it any different, any less true. Because your ancestors put blacks in the predicament that they're in. And as such, just because you were raised in an environment where everything was there for you, and you think, I have nothing to do with slavery. Of course not, you weren't around. Blacks worked 18 hours a day as slave, not getting paid, as slave. If they show any sign of fatigue, they get beat until they bled. And if a black slave manages to escape, he will be hunted like a dog, shot down if they cannot capture him. And if they capture him back, he will go through the worst torture. Sometimes they cut a limb, a finger, a toe, just to teach him a lesson not to do that. And to teach the others what awaits them if they try. Yes, that nice grandfather that they've been telling you about. That nice husband. Yes, he put black slave through those kind of torture. For the slave, he was just a monster. And yet, you grew up hearing one thing: blacks are violent. Blacks are criminals. Blacks are thieves. But your great-grandpa, great-great-great-grandpa, who did all those things to blacks, you grew up knowing he was a nice man. No, he wasn't. He was a monster, a criminal. In fact, by today's standard, he would have gotten death penalty for doing it just to one slave, let alone for many, many slaves. Yes, your ancestor who owned slave was a monster. Not a nice man. Nice. Yes, he could have been a good father. He provided to his family, but at the cost, to the detriment of the horror that he inflicted on blacks. Now, as you begin to understand the kind of behavior your ancestor had, the kind of monster that they were, now you will begin to understand why blacks had to begin to rebel against the slave master. Because no one would love the idea of being a slave. No one would want to stay in that predicament. Now, all those horror that I mentioned to you, Those are physical horror. How about the emotional and the psychological, where the slave owner would just rip families apart, send kids to be sold at auction? That picture of a rendering of a black woman, mother, who is begging for his baby, now that is being auctioned, held in one hand by the auctioneer. Yes, those were normal course of business for whites. And you know what? Blacks were the criminal. And that's what you grew up hearing. Blacks were the criminal. And it was repeated over and over and over, passed down, stories were told. And guess what? By the time you become an adult, you also pass it down to the next generation. But the story that were never told to you is your ancestors were the real criminals. That is emotional war on blacks. Sometimes the slave masters would separate smaller baby that they may not be able to sell. Now they would let the slave, the women, think that they had a change of heart. They go to auction the baby, and the baby would not be auctioned. Nobody purchased it. So they would use that and come back and give the baby back to the women as if they had a change of heart and say, "Here is your baby. I was just teaching you a lesson." Psychological war on blacks. The casualties have been mounting. They did it to women. They did it to men. They did it to kids. They did it to young children. But you grew up hearing blacks are the criminals. They are the thieves. And it's so prevalent in our society, and it continues up to this day, that when a police officer gunned down an unarmed black man, the first defense, "I was afraid for my life." So that defense has not abated a bit. It began during slavery time. That was one of the most powerful ammunition used by the whites. Torture the blacks, starve them to death, kill them, and when that doesn't work, call them thieves, criminals, because that's the way to keep them in bondage. The war on blacks has never abated. Yes, slavery ended officially in 1865. But all the vestiges, all the marks, all the traces of slavery are still here, haunting blacks, because the war continues. The past 2 years, it has been plastered on our screen, TV screen that is, of police officer gunning down blacks across the country, executing them. Unarmed black men gunned down by police officer. The police officer, "I was afraid for my life. I thought he had a gun." That's a defense. Over and over and over. And as it was during slavery, there is nothing to worry about, because guess what? White society control all the levers of government and organization. So don't worry. You are afraid for your life? I understand. I'm white too, you know. So they get a free pass. Out on the street, back to their job, suspended for a few weeks, suspended with pay. We're investigating. Yes, because of that problem, and that's the way it was during slavery, and that's the way it is now. The war on blacks has never abated. The casualties have been mounting. According to historical record, during the 18th century alone, 6 million blacks were taken out of Africa. And those were very healthy individuals who would work to advance the continent, to advance the country. They were chased, captured, chained, brought here to America in slavery. Now, this is what we know here in America. And the 6 millions we're talking about are the 6 million that made it to America as slaves. We don't know how many they dropped at sea that could not make it. Because as I mentioned before, during the journey, weeks in journey, a number of those slaves died. So they completely depleted the continent of those very healthy individuals that could have helped the continent advance in agriculture. No, they chased them down, tortured them, killed them, chain them, and bring them here in America for more torture. And guess what? Blacks are the criminal. What is such an irony that our society continue to peddle that lie, and it continue to take roots in our society, that blacks are the one to be afraid of because they're violent. A story that passed down from generation to generation to generation. When a police officer killed a black, unarmed black, I was afraid for my life. You know, blacks, violent people. I was afraid for my life. I thought he was going to kill me. Unarmed. And that police officer doesn't have to worry about it because the lever of government, at every aspect in our government, they are occupied by whites, and they usually would just take care of that. In the beginning of this conversation, I gave you the example of how far back those type of system that white society put in place to make sure that the war, black continue to lose more and more on that war. The casualties continue to mount. And that is a very unfair war because usually war suppose casualties on all sides. But this war, casualties have been one-sided. Now, as we continue this conversation and show you that, yes, your ancestor, the monster that was explained to you as being a great father, a great grandfather, you know, the ancestor, they make this predicament that we're talking about today. They instituted that predicament, that environment that we're talking about. because it passed from one generation to the next. And the reason you have said that kind of sentiment towards black is because it was passed down to you. That blacks are violent, blacks are criminal, blacks are thieves. But what was never explained to you is why they were put in that predicament. And our job with this program is to give you that full picture so that you grasp the understanding as to why we are where we at, and begin to understand that there is indeed a solution, but the solution cannot be by white blaming blacks for the predicament, because blacks did not cause that situation. Blacks are victims of the situation. But as it was during slavery, and it is here again today, whenever blacks are victims, society say they are responsible for the problem. That's why when a black individual is executed on the street by a police officer, you tune into Fox, what you hear is blame for the victim. Yes, the victim is responsible for the problem. That's why he was killed. That's exactly the same approach used during slavery. And that's why it passed down and it continued, and the war on blacks continued. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1. To bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. If you have questions, comment, criticism, we would like to hear from you. And if you have a request to talk about another topic, we would like to hear and research that topic and talk at length about it, because the purpose of this program is to remove ignorance, the biggest threat to our democracy. And we know once ignorance is removed from the equation, we can all achieve a more perfect union. I hope you can join me again tomorrow at 2 p.m., during which time we will continue our conversation about, obviously, war on blacks, as well as debating the jeopardy our democracy has been facing since the presidency of Donald Trump. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Good day. I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then.
The Fourth Branch podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the People Branch publication, which can be found on the People Branch website, located at peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org website, in which you will find a number of very interesting articles. My name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. I hope you have a great afternoon or a great evening, whichever it happens to be. Hopefully you can join me again next time for another interesting episode of this podcast. That was the Fourth Branch, live from New York. Good day.